My own son stood up during his wedding reception and told 300 guests that I was a worthless old man who had contributed nothing to his success and should be grateful he even invited me. I'm Robert Sterling, and for 40 years I've been quietly building something my son never bothered to understand. He spent $500,000 on flowers alone for his Napa Valley wedding, bragged about his self-made millionaire status to everyone who would listen, and made sure the seating chart placed me at the back table with distant relatives he barely knew.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
What he didn't know was that the $2 million trust fund he'd been counting on to expand his tech company wasn't just his inheritance, it was completely under my control. And when he publicly humiliated the man who had been secretly funding his entire lifestyle for 32 years, I decided it was time he learned the difference between earning respect and demanding it. By the time the wedding cake was served, his financial future had changed forever. If you're watching this, please subscribe and let me know where you're watching from, because this story starts 4 decades ago when I made a promise to myself about the difference between supporting your children and spoiling them beyond recognition. That promise would cost my son more than he ever imagined and teach both of us lessons that money can't buy. Most people look at me and see exactly what my son Michael sees: a 72-year-old retired postal worker who drives a 15-year-old Toyota Camry with a dented bumper and 200,000 miles on the odometer. Someone who shops at Costco in bulk, clips coupons from Sunday newspapers, and lives in the same modest 3-bedroom house in Sacramento that I bought in 1987. Michael Sterling Hayes, 32 years old, Stanford MBA, founder and CEO of a tech startup called Innovate Now Solutions, and absolutely convinced that his old man is an embarrassment who never amounted to anything. "Dad, you just don't understand how business works in the modern world," he told me 6 months ago when I asked about his company's finances. "You delivered mail for 30 years. I'm building a technology empire that's going to revolutionize e-commerce logistics." The way he said delivered mail made it sound like I had spent my career picking up trash, not serving communities and managing postal operations across 3 counties. Michael had been telling this same story for years, how he was a self-made entrepreneur who had built his company from nothing, who had overcome the limitations of growing up in a working-class family, who had transcended his humble beginnings through sheer determination and brilliance. The narrative was compelling, and mostly true, except for one crucial detail that Michael either forgot or chose to ignore. Every major milestone in his life had been quietly supported by the man he was now ashamed to call his father. Stanford tuition, paid in full by his grandfather's life insurance policy that I'd carefully invested in mutual funds for 18 years. His first apartment in Palo Alto, down payment came from my Postal Service pension fund. The seed money for Innovate Now Solutions, that was the $60,000 I'd saved from working overtime shifts every Christmas season for a decade. Money I'd given him as a graduation gift that he'd accepted without asking where a postal worker had found that kind of cash. I never told him about the sacrifices because I didn't want him to feel burdened by guilt or obligation. I never mentioned the double shifts I worked to afford his private school tuition or the vacation I never took so he could have the latest computer for his programming classes. I never explained that the reason I still lived in the same small house wasn't because I couldn't afford better, but because every dollar I saved was being invested in his future. I thought I was giving him the gift of believing in himself, a feeling like he could accomplish anything through his own merit. Instead, I had created a man who genuinely believed that success was something that happened to people like him, and failure was something that happened to people like me. The wedding planning process revealed just how deep his embarrassment ran. When Michael announced his engagement to Victoria Pemberton Hayes, daughter of a prominent San Francisco investment banker, I was genuinely happy for him. Victoria seemed like a lovely young woman, educated and accomplished in her own right, and I looked forward to welcoming her into our small family. but the wedding planning became an exercise in minimizing my presence and maximizing the impression that Michael had emerged from nowhere, fully formed and successful. "Dad, I think it would be better if we kept the wedding party small," Michael explained during one of our monthly phone calls. "Victoria's family is very traditional, and they're used to a certain kind of, presentation." I asked what kind of presentation he meant, and he got uncomfortable. "Well, her father went to Harvard, her mother is on the board of the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and her brother is a partner at Goldman Sachs. They're not really used to, postal workers." I told him I understood, that I didn't need to be in the wedding party, that I was just happy to be there to celebrate his special day. But Michael's discomfort with his background kept growing as the wedding approached. He started referring to me as his family from Sacramento, rather than his father when talking to Victoria's relatives. He asked me to wear a specific suit that he would buy for me, just to make sure everything coordinates properly. He suggested that I might be more comfortable sitting with the other older relatives rather than in the front row where the father of the groom traditionally sits. Each conversation made it clearer that Michael wasn't just planning a wedding. He was planning his official transformation from the son of a postal worker into the kind of man that belonged in Victoria's world. And that transformation required making me as invisible as possible. I went along with it because I loved him, because I wanted him to be happy, and because I thought maybe this was just wedding stress, making him act in ways that weren't really reflective of who he was as a person. The venue he chose for the wedding was a clear statement about the life he wanted to live and the past he wanted to leave behind. Auberge du Soleil in Napa Valley, a luxury resort where rooms start at $800 a night and the cheapest wedding package costs more than most people make in a year. Michael booked the entire resort for the weekend, flew in guests from across the country, hired a celebrity wedding planner who coordinated events for tech billionaires and Hollywood stars. "This is going to be the kind of wedding people remember," he told me during one of his rare calls in the weeks leading up to the event. "Victoria's family expects a certain standard, and I want to show them that I belong in their world." When I asked about the cost, he laughed it off. "Dad, this is an investment in our future. The connections we'll make, the impression we'll create, it's all part of building the kind of life Victoria and I want to have together." The guest list was a who's who of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, Stanford alumni, and San Francisco society families. 300 people, most of whom Michael had met through Victoria or through his business networking events. I recognized maybe a dozen names on the list. A few cousins, Michael's college roommate, and some family friends from Sacramento that Michael felt obligated to invite but clearly wished he could exclude. When the wedding weekend finally arrived, I drove up to Napa Valley in my old Camry, listening to classic rock on the radio and trying to prepare myself for 3 days of feeling like an outsider at my own wedding son's wedding. I had bought a new suit, gotten a haircut, and practiced small talk about topics I thought might interest Victoria's family. I wanted to make Michael proud, even if he seemed determined to make sure no one knew exactly who I was or how I fit into his success story. The rehearsal dinner was held at a private winery with a view of rolling hills covered in perfectly manicured vineyard rows. The tables were set with linens that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, and the wine being served was older than Michael's bride. I found my assigned seat, Table 9, in the back, next to Victoria's great aunt from Portland and a college friend of the bride's whose husband spent the entire evening talking about his cryptocurrency investments. From my table, I could see Michael working the room like a politician, shaking hands and exchanging business cards, making sure every important person in attendance knew about Innovate Now solutions and his plans for expansion. Victoria looked radiant in a dress that probably cost more than my car, and I felt genuinely happy watching the two of them together. This was what I had worked for, what all those overtime shifts and sacrificed vacations had been building toward, my son living the kind of life where he could marry for love instead of financial security, where he could take risks and chase dreams instead of worrying about making ends meet. But as the evening progressed, I started to notice something that made me uncomfortable. Every time someone asked Michael about his background, about his family, about how he had gotten started in business, his answers seemed designed to minimize any suggestion that he had received help or support along the way. He talked about bootstrapping his company, about coming from humble beginnings, about having to work twice as hard to prove himself in Silicon Valley. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. All of which was true, but incomplete in a way that erased my existence from his origin story. The moment that should have warned me about what was coming happened during the toasts at the rehearsal dinner. Victoria's father stood up and gave a beautiful speech about welcoming Michael into their family, about how impressed he was with Michael's accomplishments, about the bright future ahead for the young couple. Then Michael stood up to respond, and I listened to my son deliver a 15-minute speech about his journey from modest circumstances to entrepreneurial success that mentioned his mother exactly once and never mentioned me at all. I learned early in life that if you want something, you have to work for it. Nobody was going to hand me anything, so I had to create my own opportunities and build my own path forward. Victoria, you're marrying someone who understands the value of hard work and determination, someone who will never take our success for granted because I know what it's like to have nothing. I sat at table 9, applauding my son's speech, wondering when exactly.
The wedding day itself was everything Michael had promised it would be. A spectacle of wealth and sophistication that would establish his place in Victoria's social circle permanently. The ceremony took place in the resort's hillside vineyard, with 300 white chairs arranged in perfect rows, facing an altar decorated with thousands of dollars worth of white roses and peonies. The bride arrived in a horse-drawn carriage, the groom wore a custom Italian suit, and the string quartet played music that had been specially arranged for the occasion by a composer who had worked with the San Francisco Symphony. I sat in the 5th row, not the front row where the father of the groom traditionally sits, wearing the navy blue suit Michael had selected for me and trying to blend in with Victoria's extended family from the East Coast. The ceremony was beautiful, and I felt genuinely moved watching my son marry the woman he loved. But there was something hollow about the experience that I couldn't quite identify. Maybe it was the way the officiant introduced Michael as a self-made entrepreneur who has built his success through determination and vision. Or the way Victoria's vows praised him for showing her that anything is possible when you believe in yourself and work for your dreams. Every description of Michael seemed designed to emphasize that he had accomplished everything alone, that his success was entirely self-generated, that he was the kind of man who had lifted himself up by his own bootstraps and transformed his life through sheer force of will. It was a compelling narrative, and I understood why it appealed to Victoria's family and Michael's business associates. The American dream in action, the tech entrepreneur who had emerged from modest circumstances to build something significant and lasting. The reception was held in the resort's main ballroom, which had been transformed into something that belonged in a Hollywood movie rather than real life. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting warm light over tables set with gold-rimmed china and centerpieces that towered 3 feet high. Each table setting included a personalized menu printed on handmade paper, and the open bar featured top-shelf liquor that cost more per bottle than I spent on groceries in a month. A 12-piece orchestra played during dinner, and Michael had hired a celebrity chef from San Francisco to prepare a 7-course meal that showcased local ingredients and wine pairings from the resort's private collection. My assigned seat was at table 12 this time, even further from the head table than I had been at the rehearsal dinner. I found myself sitting with a collection of distant relatives and family friends who seemed as overwhelmed by the opulence as I was. The woman next to me, Victoria's second cousin from Ohio, spent most of the evening taking pictures of everything and whispering to her husband about how much she thought each element of the wedding must have cost. The man across from me, someone's college roommate from 20 years ago, kept checking his phone and looking uncomfortable in a rental tuxedo that didn't quite fit properly. From my table in the back, I watched Michael and Victoria make their grand entrance as husband and wife,
watched them share their first dance to a song performed live by a Grammy-winning artist Michael had flown in from Los Angeles specifically for the occasion. They looked perfect together, like they belonged in the world of wealth and privilege that surrounded them, like they had always lived in ballrooms with crystal chandeliers and 7-course dinners prepared by celebrity chefs. During the cocktail hour before dinner, I tried to mingle and make conversation with the other guests, most of whom seemed to know each other from business or social connections that went back years. I introduced myself as Michael's father and watched people's expressions change subtly as they processed this information and tried to reconcile the man in front of them with their expectations of what a tech entrepreneur's father should look like. The conversations were polite but brief, filled with the kind of small talk that people use when they're not sure what they have in common with someone. "So, you must be very proud of Michael's success," one of Victoria's father's business partners said to me during cocktail hour, holding a glass of champagne that probably cost more than I typically spend on a bottle of wine. "It's remarkable what he's accomplished at such a young age." I agreed that I was proud, that Michael had always been driven and ambitious, that it was wonderful to see him building something meaningful with his life. "Did he get his entrepreneurial spirit from you?" the man asked me, and I could see him trying to figure out how a postal worker had produced a son who moved in Silicon Valley circles. Michael's always been determined to create his own path, which was true but incomplete. He's never been satisfied with just getting by. He's always wanted to build something bigger. The man nodded approvingly and moved on to talk to someone else, leaving me standing by myself next to a table of hors d'oeuvres that had been flown in from France specifically for the wedding. The dinner itself was an elaborate production, with each course introduced by the celebrity chef and paired with wines that the resort sommelier described in detail before each pour. I found myself thinking about all the times Michael and I had shared pizza on Friday nights when he was growing up, or the Sunday dinners I used to cook when he was in high school. Simple meals that we ate at the kitchen table while talking about his classes and his plans for the future. Those conversations felt more real to me than this elaborate performance, but I'd understood that this was the world Michael wanted to live in now, and I was genuinely happy that he had found a way to belong here. The trouble started during the toasts, which began immediately after the main course and continued for nearly an hour. Victoria's father spoke about gaining a son and about Michael's impressive accomplishments in the tech world. Victoria's brother talked about how Michael had proven himself worthy of joining their family through his business success and his obvious devotion to Victoria. Michael's college roommate shared stories about their time at Stanford and Michael's determination to make himself of something despite coming from humble circumstances. Every description of Michael seemed designed to emphasize that he had accomplished everything alone, that his success was entirely self-generated, that he was the kind of man who had lifted himself up by his own bootstraps and transformed his life through sheer force of will. It was a compelling narrative, and I understood why it appealed to Victoria's family and Michael's business associates. The American dream in action, the tech entrepreneur who had emerged from modest circumstances to build something significant and lasting. Then Victoria's maid of honor, her sister Caroline, stood up to give what she announced would be the final toast of the evening. Caroline was a lawyer in Manhattan, perfectly polished and confident, and she began her speech by talking about how much she had come to love and respect Michael since Victoria had brought him into their family. She praised his integrity, his ambition, and his commitment to building a life worthy of her sister's love and trust. "Michael represents something that our family has always valued," Caroline said, looking out at the room full of successful, well-dressed people who hung on her every word. "Michael represents the idea that in America, you can still create your own destiny through hard work and determination. Victoria is marrying someone who started with nothing and built something remarkable through his own efforts. Someone who proves that success is still possible for people who are willing to work for it and never give up on their dreams." The room erupted in applause, and Michael stood up to acknowledge the praise, beaming with pride and satisfaction. This was exactly the moment he had been working toward for months, official recognition from Victoria's family that he belonged among them, that he had earned his place through merit rather than simply marrying into it. He looked genuinely happy, in a way I haven't seen since he was a child. And despite my growing discomfort with the narrative being constructed around his success, I felt glad that he was experiencing this moment of validation and acceptance. But Caroline wasn't finished with her toast. She raised her glass higher and continued speaking, her voice carrying clearly across the ballroom to every table, including mine in the back, where I sat with the other relatives who didn't quite fit into the main story being told about this wedding. What makes Michael's success even more impressive is that he accomplished all this without the kind of family support that many people take for granted. Victoria and Michael both come from families that value education and hard work, but Michael had to create his own opportunities and find his own path forward. He's truly self-made in every sense of the word, and that makes him exactly the kind of man we're proud to welcome into our family. The applause was even louder this time, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach as I realized what Caroline was saying, and more importantly, what Michael wasn't correcting. According to the official story being told at his wedding, I didn't exist as a positive force in his life. I was part of the humble circumstances he had overcome, part of the modest background he had transcended, part of the limitations he had refused to accept. My 30 years of working overtime shifts to pay for his education, my sacrifices to fund his startup, my quiet support of every dream and ambition he had ever expressed, none of that fit into the narrative of the self-made entrepreneur who had accomplished everything alone. I sat at table 12, applauding my son's transformation from the child I had raised into the man who was now officially embarrassed by the father who had made his success possible.
The breaking point came during what should have been the most joyful moment of the entire wedding celebration. After Caroline's toast about Michael's supposedly self-made success, the DJ announced that it was time for the traditional father-son dance. I had been looking forward to this moment for months, imagining it as a chance to share a quiet, meaningful moment with Michael in the middle of all the elaborate celebration. I had even picked out a song that reminded me of his childhood, something we could dance to while I told him how proud I was of the man he had become. But when the DJ called for the father of the groom to join Michael on the dance floor, something unexpected happened. Michael looked around the room, his eyes scanning the crowd as if he were searching for someone, and then he walked not toward my table in the back, but toward Victoria's father, Harrison Pemberton Hayes. The two men embraced in the center of the dance floor while the orchestra began playing a slow, elegant waltz that I had never heard before. I sat frozen at table 12, watching my son dance with his father-in-law, while 300 wedding guests looked on approvingly. The DJ's voice came through the sound system, explaining that Michael had chosen to honor the man who welcomed him into the family and showed him what true success looks like. Harrison Pemberton Hayes, the investment banker who had met Michael less than 2 years ago, was being celebrated as the father figure who had guided Michael's journey to success. The applause from the crowd was warm and enthusiastic, and I could see people wiping away tears as they watched this touching tribute to family bonds and mutual respect. Victoria beamed from the head table, clearly moved by her husband's gesture of appreciation toward her father. Michael looked genuinely emotional as he danced with the man he had chosen to honor as his real father figure, the man whose guidance and support had supposedly made his success possible. I remained seated while the dance continued, my hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The woman next to me, Victoria's cousin from Ohio, leaned over and whispered, "That's so sweet. It's wonderful when young people appreciate the wisdom of their elders." She had no idea that Michael's actual father was sitting 3 feet away from her, watching his son publicly reject 32 years of love and sacrifice in favor of a relationship that had existed for less than 24 months. When the dance ended,
Michael hugged Harrison and spoke into the microphone that the DJ handed him. "I want to thank Harrison for showing me what it means to be a successful man and a devoted family patriarch," Michael said, his voice carrying clearly across the ballroom. "Victoria and I are both lucky to have someone like him as an example of how to build a life worth living. He's taught me so much about business, about family values, and about what it takes to create lasting success." The applause was thunderous, and Harrison looked genuinely touched by Michael's public acknowledgement. But Michael wasn't finished speaking. He looked out at the crowd of wedding guests, his confidence building as he continued his impromptu speech. "You know, growing up, I always wondered what it would be like to have a father figure who understood ambition and success. Someone who could guide me and show me how to navigate the business world, how to set goals and achieve them, how to build something meaningful with your life. I'm grateful that Victoria brought that kind of wisdom and guidance into my life through her family." I felt something break inside my chest as I listened to my son explain to 300 people that he had grown up without a father figure who understood success or ambition. According to Michael's version of events, I had been present during his childhood, but absent in any meaningful way, incapable of providing the kind of guidance and support that a successful person needed to thrive in the modern world. "Harrison has shown me what it looks like when a man takes responsibility for his family's future," Michael went on, warming to his theme while the crowd listened intently. "He's taught me about long-term thinking, about building wealth that lasts for generations, about creating opportunities for the people you love. These are lessons I never learned growing up, and I'm grateful to be learning them now from someone who's actually lived them." The implication was clear, even if Michael wasn't stating it directly. His biological father had failed to teach him about responsibility, long-term thinking, wealth building, or creating opportunities. His biological father had been present but ineffective, caring but ultimately useless when it came to providing the kind of guidance that actually mattered for success in life. Victoria's family and their social circle nodded approvingly as Michael continued his tribute to his father-in-law. This was exactly the kind of story they wanted to hear. The humble young man who had found success through hard work and was now wise enough to recognize and appreciate the mentorship of someone who had already achieved the kind of life Michael was building for himself. But Michael was still not finished speaking. He looked around the room, his eyes briefly meeting mine across the crowded ballroom before moving on without any sign of recognition or acknowledgement. "I think about my future children sometimes," Michael said, his voice getting stronger and more confident as he spoke. "And I know that they might grow up with advantages I never had. They're going to have grandfathers who can teach them about business and success and building wealth. They're going to have family connections and opportunities that will help them achieve their dreams. They won't have to figure everything out on their own the way I did." The crowd murmured appreciatively, moved by Michael's vision of the secure, privileged future he was planning for his children. But all I could hear was my son declaring that his future children would benefit from having grandfathers who could teach them valuable lessons, while completely ignoring the fact that they already had a grandfather sitting in the back of the room who had spent 32 years teaching Michael everything he knew about work ethic, determination, and sacrifice. "Most importantly," Michael continued, "they're going to grow up understanding that success is something you earn through intelligence and hard work, not something you just hope will happen to you. They'll have role models who can show them what real achievement looks like." I stood up from table 12. I couldn't sit there any longer. Listening to my son explain to 300 people that his children would benefit from having grandfathers who could teach them valuable lessons, while the man who had worked overtime for a decade to pay for Michael's Stanford education sat ignored in the back of the room. Michael noticed the movement and looked in my direction, his speech faltering slightly as he saw me standing. For a moment, our eyes met across the ballroom, and I saw a flash of something, maybe guilt or recognition of what he was doing, but he recovered quickly and continued speaking. "I just want to say how grateful I am to have found a family that shares my values and understands my goals.
Michael concluded, raising his glass toward the head table where Victoria and her parents sat beaming with pride. Here's to building something lasting together. The toast was enthusiastic and prolonged, with guests standing and applauding Michael's heartfelt tribute to his new family and his vision for the future. I remained standing at table 12, not applauding, not raising my glass, just watching my son accept congratulations for a speech that had effectively erased me from my past, present, and future. That's when I realized that Michael's embarrassment about his background wasn't just social awkwardness or wedding stress. He genuinely believed that his success had happened despite me, not because of me. He had convinced himself that growing up with a postal worker father had been a disadvantage he had overcome through his own brilliance and determination, rather than an advantage that had given him security, support, and opportunities that many people never receive. As the applause died down and the dancing resumed, I walked quietly out of the ballroom and toward the resort lobby, where I could make the phone calls that would change both our lives forever.
The resort lobby was mercifully quiet compared to the celebration continuing in the ballroom behind me. I found a leather armchair in a corner near the stone fireplace, pulled out my phone, and stared at it for several minutes before making the first call that would change everything. My hands were shaking slightly, not from nervousness, but from 32 years of suppressed frustration finally finding its way to the surface. The first call was to my attorney, Patricia Morse, who had been handling my legal affairs for over 2 decades. She answered on the third ring, despite it being nearly 10 o'clock on a Saturday evening. "Robert, is everything all right? I wasn't expecting to hear from you tonight," Patricia said, her voice concerned. She knew I wouldn't call on a weekend unless something serious had happened. "Patricia, I need you to prepare some documents, and I need them prepared tonight," I said, keeping my voice low so the hotel staff wouldn't overhear. "I want to revoke the Sterling Family Trust, effective immediately." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Patricia had drafted the trust documents herself 5 years ago, and she knew exactly what revoking it would mean for Michael's financial future. "Robert, that's a significant decision. The trust contains over $2 million designated for Michael's business expansion and future security. Are you certain you want to take this step tonight, in the middle of his wedding celebration?" "I'm certain," I said. "Michael just spent 20 minutes explaining to 300 people how grateful he is to have finally found a father figure who understands success and ambition. He danced with his father-in-law instead of with me, and then gave a speech about how his future children will be lucky to have grandfathers who can teach them about achievement and building wealth. Apparently, I don't qualify as someone who understands those things." Patricia was quiet for a moment, processing what I was telling her. She had known Michael since he was a teenager, had watched me work overtime shifts to pay for his education, had helped me structure the trust specifically to support his entrepreneurial dreams. "What exactly do you want me to do?" she asked finally. "I want the trust dissolved completely. I want the funds transferred back to my personal accounts, and I want documentation that Michael Sterling Hayes is no longer the beneficiary of any financial instruments or legal structures connected to my estate." "Robert, I can prepare those documents, but I have to ask, is this really about what happened tonight, or is this about a larger pattern of behavior?" The question stopped me cold, because it forced me to articulate something I had been avoiding for months. "Patricia, my son just told 300 people that he grew up without a father figure who could teach him about success. He spent the last year referring to me as his family from Sacramento instead of his father. He seats me at the back of his own wedding reception and introduces his father-in-law as the man who showed him what real achievement looks like. Apparently, I don't qualify as someone who understands those things." Patricia was quiet for a moment, processing what I was telling her. She had known Michael since he was a teenager, had watched me work overtime shifts to pay for his education, had helped me structure the trust specifically to support his entrepreneurial dreams. "What exactly do you want me to do?" she asked finally. "I want the trust dissolved completely.
I want the funds transferred back to my personal accounts, and I want documentation that Michael Sterling Hayes is no longer the beneficiary of any financial instruments or legal structures connected to my estate. Robert, I can prepare those documents, but I have to ask, is this really about what happened tonight, or is this about a larger pattern of behavior? The question stopped me cold because it forced me to articulate something I had been avoiding for months. Patricia, my son just told 300 people that he grew up without a father figure who could teach him about success. He spent the last year referring to me as his family from Sacramento instead of his father. He seats me at the back of his own wedding reception and introduces his father-in-law as the man who showed him what real achievement looks like. This isn't about one night. This is about who my son has decided to become. I understand, Patricia said quietly. I'll have the trust revocation documents ready by morning. Do you want me to include a provision for reinstatement if circumstances change? No provisions, I said firmly. Michael wanted to be self-made. Now, he can actually be self-made. The second call was to James Mitchell, my financial advisor, and the man who had helped me build the investment portfolio that had grown far beyond what a postal worker's salary should have been able to generate. James had been after me for years to be more aggressive with my investments, to take advantage of opportunities that my conservative approach was causing me to miss. Tonight felt like the right time to finally take his advice. Robert, this is unexpected. How's the wedding going? I said. The wedding is going exactly as planned. Michael is officially becoming the self-made enterprise he's always claimed to be, which is why I'm calling. I want to make some significant changes to our investment strategy, and I want to make them immediately. What kind of changes are you thinking about? I had been considering this conversation for months, ever since Michael had started talking about expanding his tech company and had mentioned that the trust fund I had established would provide the seed money for his next phase of growth. He had never asked if I was comfortable with that plan, never wondered if I might have other ideas for how that money should be used, never considered that my willingness to support his dreams might have limits. I want to liquidate the conservative positions and move everything into high-growth technology investments, I said. I want to take the kind of risks that could either double my portfolio in 5 years or lose everything. I'm 72 years old, James. It's time I started acting like someone who's earned the right to be bold. James was quiet for a moment, clearly surprised by this dramatic shift in my typically cautious investment philosophy. Robert, that's a complete reversal of everything we've discussed over the past 20 years. What's changed? What's changed is that I've spent 32 years being responsible and conservative and focused on building security for my son's future. And my son just announced to 300 people that he grew up without a father figure who could teach him about success. He spent the last year referring to me as his family from Sacramento instead of his father. He seats me at the back of his own wedding reception and introduces his father-in-law as the man who showed him what real achievement looks like. Apparently, I don't qualify as someone who understands those things. How aggressive do you want to get? James asked. Aggressive enough that Michael will never be able to dismiss me as just a postal worker again. Aggressive enough that when people ask what his father does for a living, the answer will be more impressive than delivered mail for 30 years. The third call was to Michael's business partner and co-founder, David Chen, who had become something of a surrogate son to me over the past 3 years. David actually returned my calls, actually asked about my health and my opinions, actually seemed to value the life experience I had accumulated during my decades in the working world. Unlike Michael, David had never seemed embarrassed by my background or apologetic about introducing me to his friends and colleagues. "Mr. Sterling, how's the wedding?" David asked when he answered his phone. "I'm sorry I couldn't make it, stuck in meetings with potential investors all weekend." "David, I need you to ask you something, and I need you to give me an honest answer," I said. How much of Michael's success with Innovate Now Solutions has been dependent on the financial support I've provided over the past 3 years? David was quiet for a moment, clearly surprised by the directness of my question. Mr. Sterling, is everything okay? You sound different. Everything is fine. I just need to understand the real relationship between Michael's success and the resources I've made available to him. Well, David said carefully, the initial seed funding you provided was crucial for getting us started. We wouldn't have been able to quit our day jobs and focus on building the company without that financial cushion. And knowing that Michael had the trust fund as backup gave us the confidence to take risks we might not have taken otherwise. What about ongoing operations? Michael hasn't needed to draw from the trust fund for day-to-day expenses, but knowing it was there definitely influenced our strategic decisions. We've been more willing to invest in long-term projects and turn down quick profit opportunities because we knew Michael had the financial security to wait for the right deals. And if that security disappeared tomorrow? David hesitated. Mr. Sterling, are you thinking about changing the trust arrangement? I'm thinking about a lot of things, but what I'm asking you is this. If Michael suddenly had to make Innovate Now Solutions profitable immediately, without any family financial support, could he do it? Probably, David said slowly, but it would mean making some difficult decisions about staffing and growth projections. We'd have to become a lot more conservative in our approach. Maybe take on some clients we've been turning away because their projects don't align with our long-term vision. In other words, he'd have to start making the kind of practical, responsible business decisions that people make when they don't have family money to fall back on. I guess you could put it that way, David agreed. Mr. Sterling, what's really going on? Did something happen at the wedding? I looked across the lobby toward the ballroom, where I could hear music and laughter still playing, and could see the warm light spilling out from the celebration that was continuing without me. I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, a sense of freedom from responsibility for someone else's choices and consequences. For the first time since Michael was born, his future was entirely in his own hands.
I returned to my hotel room around midnight, while the wedding reception was still in full swing 3 floors below. The sounds of celebration drifted up through the resort's carefully landscaped grounds. Laughter, music, and the occasional cheer as someone gave another toast or the DJ announced another special dance. Michael's wedding was continuing exactly as planned, a perfect culmination of months of preparation and hundreds of thousands of dollars in expenses. What Michael didn't know was that while he was dancing with his new wife and accepting congratulations from 300 guests, the financial foundation of his future had been quietly dismantled by a phone call from the resort lobby. The trust fund he had been counting on to expand Innovate Now Solutions no longer existed. The conservative, responsible father who had been holding him back from taking real entrepreneurial risks had just taken the biggest risk of his own 72-year life. I spent the rest of the weekend in my hotel room, ordering room service and watching the financial markets on my laptop, while the wedding festivities continued around me. I had always been a conservative investor, the kind of person who chose mutual funds over individual stocks and valued steady growth over dramatic gains. But Saturday night's phone calls had changed all of that. By Sunday afternoon, my entire investment portfolio had been restructured around high-risk, high-reward technology stocks and emerging market opportunities that could either make me genuinely wealthy or wipe out 40 years of careful savings. The irony wasn't lost on me. Michael had spent years dismissing my cautious approach to money as evidence that I didn't understand how successful people think about wealth and risk. Now, I was betting everything on the same kind of aggressive investment strategy that he used to lecture me about during our increasingly rare phone conversations. The difference was that I was doing it with money I had earned through 40 years of actual work, while he had been planning to do it with money that had been given to him by the postal worker father he was embarrassed to acknowledge. Sunday morning brought the first concrete evidence that my decisions were going to have immediate consequences. Patricia Morse called at 8 a.m. to confirm that the trust revocation documents had been processed and filed with the appropriate authorities. The Sterling Family Trust had been officially dissolved, and the $2 million it had contained were now back in my personal investment accounts, where they were already being deployed in the aggressive growth strategy James Mitchell and I had discussed. "The paperwork is complete," Patricia told me. "Michael will receive official notification by registered mail within the next week, along with documentation explaining that he is no longer the beneficiary of any financial instruments connected to your estate." "What will the notification tell him?" I asked. "It will inform him that the Sterling Family Trust established in 2019 has been dissolved by the grantor, and that all assets previously designated for his benefit have been redistributed according to your revised financial plan. He'll also receive copies of the new estate documents that remove him as a beneficiary of your life insurance policies and retirement accounts." I had forgotten about the life insurance policies. When Michael was born, I had purchased a substantial policy that would ensure he would be financially secure if anything happened to me. Over the years, I had increased the coverage as my income grew and as Michael's needs became more expensive. By the time he graduated from Stanford, the policy was worth over $500,000, money that I had always assumed would help him build whatever life he wanted to create for himself. "Everything?" I asked Patricia. "Everything. You made it clear that you wanted Michael to experience genuine financial independence. This is what genuine financial independence looks like." The second call came from James Mitchell, who had spent Sunday morning executing the investment strategy we had outlined the night before. My conservative portfolio of bonds and blue-chip stocks had been liquidated, and the proceeds had been reinvested in a carefully selected collection of high-growth technology companies, emerging market funds, and speculative investments that carried significant risk but offered the potential for extraordinary returns. "It's done," James told me. "Your portfolio is now positioned for maximum growth potential. If these investments perform the way we're projecting, you could see returns of 30 to 40% annually over the next 5 years. Of course, you could also lose everything if the markets move against us." "What are the odds?" I asked. "Honestly, about 60-40 in favor of significant gains. The companies we've invested in are solid, the market trends are positive, and the risk-reward calculations are favorable. But you're no longer investing like someone who's planning for a comfortable retirement. You're investing like someone who wants to build real wealth, which means accepting real risk." I had never thought of myself as someone who wanted to build real wealth. For 40 years, my financial goals had been simple: save enough to live comfortably in retirement and leave something meaningful for Michael's future. But Saturday night clarified something I hadn't previously understood about my own motivations and desires. I didn't want to be remembered as the postal worker who had been lucky enough to leave his son a small inheritance. I wanted to be remembered as someone who had built something significant with his life. The third development came from an unexpected source. David Chen called Sunday afternoon, ostensibly to thank me for my support of Innovate Now solutions over the past 3 years, but really to find out what I had meant by my cryptic comments the night before. "Mr. Sterling, I've been thinking about our conversation last night. You sounded like you were considering some major changes. I wanted to make sure everything is okay between you and Michael." "David, let me ask you something. When you and Michael talk about the company's future, how often does he mention the trust fund as part of your expansion planning?" "Pretty regularly. We've been assuming that money would be available for our Series A funding round next year. It's not the foundation of our business plan, but it's definitely part of our growth strategy." "And if that funding weren't available?" "We'd have to look at other options. Angel investors, venture capital, maybe taking on some clients we've been avoiding because their projects don't align with our long-term vision. It would change our timeline and probably force us to be more conservative in our hiring and development plans." "Would the company survive?" "Absolutely. We'd just have to operate like a typical startup instead of like a startup with family money backing it up. More pressure, more risk, more immediate focus on profitability." "David, I want you to understand something. Michael gave a speech last night about how grateful he was to finally have a father figure who understood success and ambition. He wasn't talking about me. He was talking about his father-in-law,
who he'd known for less than 2 years. According to Michael, he grew up without family support and accomplished everything through his own determination. Mr. Sterling, I'm sure he didn't mean. He meant exactly what he said. And now, he's going to get the chance to prove that it was true. I didn't tell David about the trust fund revocation or the investment strategy changes, but I could hear in his voice that he understood something significant had shifted in the family dynamics. Michael was about to discover what it actually felt like to be the self-made entrepreneur he had always claimed to be. Sunday evening, I drove home to Sacramento in my 15-year-old Toyota Camry, the same car that embarrassed Michael when he saw it parked outside his Stanford graduation ceremony 4 years earlier. The car that he'd prompted him to suggest that maybe I should consider upgrading my image now that he was building relationships with successful people who might judge his family based on appearances. As I drove through the California Central Valley, watching the sunset paint the hills gold and orange, I thought about the conversation I would have with Michael when he called to ask about the trust fund notification he would receive later in the week. I imagined his shock when he realized that the financial security he had been counting on was gone, his confusion when he discovered that his conservative postal worker father had suddenly become an aggressive investor willing to risk everything on speculative technology stocks. But mostly, I thought about the freedom I felt for the first time in 32 years. The freedom that came from no longer being responsible for someone else's financial security, no longer sacrificing my own goals and dreams to support someone who publicly dismissed those sacrifices as irrelevant to his success. Michael had wanted to be self-made. Now he finally would be. And I had wanted to build something meaningful with my life. Now I finally could. The only question was whether either of us would be strong enough to handle the consequences of getting exactly what we thought we wanted.
The phone call came on Tuesday morning, exactly as I had expected it would. I was sitting in my kitchen, drinking coffee and reading the financial news on my tablet when Michael's name appeared on my caller ID. It was the first time he had called me since the wedding weekend, and I knew exactly why he was calling. "Dad, what the hell did you do?" His voice was tight with panic and anger, none of the polished confidence he had displayed during his wedding speech 3 days earlier. "Good morning, Michael," I said calmly. "How are you and Victoria enjoying married life?" "Don't play games with me. I got a registered letter from your attorney this morning. It says you dissolved the trust fund. It says you removed me as a beneficiary of your life insurance. What is this about?" I set down my coffee cup and looked out the kitchen window at the same modest backyard where Michael had played as a child, where I had taught him to throw a baseball and helped him with homework at the picnic table I had built with my own hands. "It's about giving you exactly what you asked for," I said. "You wanted to be self-made. You told 300 people at your wedding that you accomplished everything without family support. Now you can prove that it's true." "Dad, this is insane. You can't just destroy my future because you got your feelings hurt at the wedding." "I didn't destroy your future, Michael. I gave you the opportunity to build your own future without relying on money from the postal worker father you're embarrassed to acknowledge." There was silence on the other end of the line, and I could hear Michael's breathing getting heavier as the full implications of the trust fund dissolution started to sink in. "You don't understand," he said finally. "That money wasn't just sitting in some account collecting dust. It was part of Innovate Now's growth strategy. David and I have been planning our expansion based on that funding being available." "Then you and David will have to come up with a new plan," I said, "one that doesn't depend on financial support from someone you consider worthless." "I never said you were worthless." "Actually, you did. You said it to 300 people when you explained that your children would be lucky to have grandfathers who could teach them about success and achievement, while your actual grandfather sat in the back of the room listening to you erase 32 years of his life from your success story." That's not what I meant. I was honoring Harrison for welcoming me into their family. It wasn't about you. Everything you said that night was about me, Michael. It was about how you grew up without a father figure who understood success. It was about how grateful you are to finally have someone who can teach you about building wealth and creating opportunities. It was about how your children will have advantages you never had. Every single word was designed to make it clear that your postal worker father had contributed nothing meaningful to your life. Dad, I was trying to make Victoria's family feel appreciated. It was politics, not personal. It became personal when you made it public, when you stood up in front of everyone who matters in your life and declared that you had no family support growing up. You made a choice about what kind of relationship we were going to have going forward. Look, Michael said when he came back to the phone, maybe I could have handled things better at the wedding. But you can't punish me financially because you didn't like my speech. That's not how families work. You're absolutely right. That's not how families work. Families work by supporting each other, by acknowledging each other's contributions, by treating each other with respect and gratitude. But according to your wedding speech, we're not functioning as a family. According to you, I'm just some guy who happened to live in the same house while you figured out how to become successful despite having no meaningful guidance or support. Dad, please, I know you're upset, but we can work this out. Victoria and I can come up to Sacramento this weekend. We can talk through what happened and figure out how to move forward. Michael, what happened is that you told the truth about how you see our relationship, and I responded by making that truth into reality. You wanted to be someone who succeeded without family money. Now you are. There was another long pause, and when Michael spoke again, his voice had changed from angry to pleading. Do you have any idea what this does to my business? To my plans? To everything I've been working toward? It forces you to work harder and take responsibility for your own success, I said. According to your wedding speech, that's exactly the kind of challenge that successful people thrive on. This is different, and you know it. I made those plans based on promises you made. You can't just change the rules in the middle of the game. What promises? I asked. When did I promise you that trust fund money? Michael was quiet for a moment, clearly trying to remember a conversation that had never actually taken place. It was understood. You set up the trust. You told me it was for my future security and business expansion. You made me believe that money would be there when I needed it. I set up the trust when you were 27 years old and struggling to get your business off the ground. I wanted to make sure you had a safety net if things didn't work out. But that was 5 years ago, Michael. 5 years during which you never once acknowledged that safety net or expressed any gratitude for the sacrifices I made to create it. I thought you understood that I was grateful. I thought you knew I appreciated everything you did for me. How would I know that? When was the last time you thanked me for paying your Stanford tuition? When was the last time you acknowledged that the seed money for your business came from my pension fund? When was the last time you introduced me to someone as the father who worked overtime for 10 years to give you opportunities I never had? Michael didn't answer because we both knew that those conversations had never actually taken place. Dad, look, maybe I haven't been good at expressing appreciation. Maybe I've taken some things for granted. But we can fix that. We can have better communication going forward. You don't need to destroy my financial future to teach me a lesson about gratitude. I'm not destroying your financial future, Michael. I'm giving you the chance to build a financial future that's actually yours. No family money, no safety net, no postal worker father holding you back with his conservative approach to risk and investment, just you and your brilliant mind and your Stanford education and your determination to succeed. But what if I fail? And for the first time in the conversation, he sounded genuinely scared and confused when he realized what genuine independence actually meant. Then you fail. And then you figure out how to succeed anyway, the way millions of actually self-made entrepreneurs do every day.
the way I did when I started investing in mutual funds with $50 a month from my postal worker salary and turned it into enough money to pay for your college education. Dad, please, I'm asking you to reconsider. Victoria and I will come up to Sacramento, we'll have dinner, we'll talk this through like adults, I'll apologize for whatever I said that hurt your feelings. Michael, this isn't about hurt feelings. This is about respect. And you can't apologize your way back to respecting someone who you fundamentally look down on. You believe that growing up with a postal worker father was a disadvantage you overcame through your own brilliance. You can't just decide to stop believing that because it's financially convenient. That's not true. I don't look down on you. You introduced me to your wedding guests as family from Sacramento. You seated me at table 12 with people you barely knew. You danced with your father-in-law instead of with me, and then gave a speech about how grateful you were to finally have a father figure who understood success. If that's not looking down on someone, what would you call it? Michael was quiet for a long time, and I could hear him breathing heavily, trying to figure out how to salvage a situation that was spiraling completely out of his control. "What do I have to do?" he asked finally. "What do I have to do to fix this?" You have to prove that you can actually accomplish what you claim you've already accomplished. You have to build a successful business without family money. You have to make Innovate Now profitable without a trust fund safety net. You have to become the genuinely self-made entrepreneur you told everyone you already were. And if I do that, if I prove I can succeed without your money, will you consider restoring the trust fund? Michael, if you can build a genuinely successful business without my help, you won't need the trust fund. You'll have something much more valuable, the knowledge that your success belongs to you. I hung up the phone before he could respond and sat in my kitchen listening to the silence that followed. For the first time in 32 years, Michael's financial future was entirely in his own hands. And for the first time in my adult life, my money was working for my own goals instead of for someone who considered my contributions worthless. The conversation had gone exactly as I had expected it would, but it still felt me hollow and sad. I had wanted Michael to understand what he had lost, but I hadn't expected him to sound so genuinely scared and confused when he realized what genuine independence actually meant. Maybe that was the point. Maybe being scared was exactly what Michael needed to discover whether he was actually capable of the success he had been claiming credit for all along.
The consequences of my decision hit Michael's life faster than either of us had anticipated. Within 2 weeks of our phone conversation, the carefully constructed world he'd built around his self-made entrepreneur image began to unravel in ways that were both predictable and devastating. The first casualty was Innovate Now Solutions' expansion timeline. David Chen called me on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the wedding, sounding exhausted and frustrated in a way I had never heard before. "Mr. Sterling, I need you to understand what's happening to the company," David said, without any preliminary small talk. "Michael told me about the trust fund situation, and I have to be honest, we're in serious trouble." "What kind of trouble?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "The kind of trouble that happens when you plan a business expansion around funding that suddenly disappears. We've already committed to hiring 5 new developers based on projected revenue from the Series A round we were planning to launch with trust fund money. We signed a lease on office space that's 3 times the size of our current location. Michael put deposits down on equipment and software licenses that we can't afford without the capital we thought we had access to." I had known that Michael's business was dependent on the trust fund, but I hadn't realized how thoroughly he had integrated that future money into his present operations. "Can't you scale back the expansion?" I asked. "We're trying, but it's complicated. Some of the commitments we made are legally binding. The new office lease runs for 2 years with no early termination clause.
The developers we hired gave notice at their previous jobs and relocated to work for us. We can't just tell them never mind and expect them to understand. What's Michael's plan for handling this? David was quiet for a moment. That's the problem, Mr. Sterling. Michael doesn't seem to have a plan. He keeps saying that he's sure you'll come around and restore the trust fund once you've made your point. He's not making the hard decisions that need to be made right now. This was exactly what I had been afraid of. Michael had never learned to handle real adversity because he had always known that my money was available as a backup plan. Now, faced with his first genuine financial crisis, he was paralyzed by the unfamiliar experience of having no safety net. David, what would you do if you were running the company alone? I'd cut our losses immediately, fire the new developers, break the office lease and pay the penalties, cancel the equipment orders even if it means losing the deposits. It would be painful, but we'd still have a viable core business that could survive and grow slowly. Why isn't Michael making those decisions? Because he's convinced that this is all temporary. He thinks if he can just convince you to restore the trust fund, he won't have to go through the humiliation of admitting to our employees and clients that we overextended ourselves based on family money that disappeared. The second consequence was more personal and potentially more damaging to Michael's carefully cultivated image. Victoria's family had begun asking questions about the sudden change in Michael and Victoria's lifestyle and future plans. Victoria called me directly on a Friday evening, something she had never done before. Her voice was strained and worried in a way that made me feel genuinely sorry for her, despite my anger at Michael. "Robert, I hope you don't mind me calling you directly. Michael doesn't know I'm doing this, but I need to understand what's happening to our family." "What do you mean?" I asked, though I had a feeling I knew where this conversation was headed. "I mean that 3 weeks ago, we were planning to buy a house in Palo Alto with a down payment from Michael's trust fund. We were talking about starting a family next year because we thought we had the financial security to support children. We were making decisions about our future based on resources that apparently don't exist anymore." Victoria had been completely blindsided by the trust fund dissolution. Michael had never explained to her that his financial security was dependent on his father's goodwill rather than his own business success. "Victoria, what exactly did Michael tell you about the trust fund when you were planning your future together?" "He told me it was family money that had been set aside for his business expansion and our future security. He said it was his inheritance, money that would be available when we needed it for major life decisions like buying a house or having children." "Did he mention that the trust fund was entirely under my control, that I could revoke it at any time for any reason?" "No," she said quietly. "He made it sound like it was already his money, like it was sitting in an account somewhere just waiting for him to decide how to use it." This was the conversation I had been dreading, because it meant that Michael hadn't just misrepresented our relationship to his wedding guests. He'd built his marriage on a foundation of financial assumptions that were completely false. "Victoria, I need you to understand something. That trust fund was created as a safety net for Michael if his business failed. It was never intended to be seed money for expansion or down payment money for luxury real estate. Michael was supposed to succeed first and then use the trust fund as additional security, not the other way around." "But why did you take it away now, right after our wedding?" I explained to Victoria what had happened at the wedding reception, how Michael had chosen to dance with her father instead of with me, how his speech had essentially erased me from his success story, how he had publicly declared that he had accomplished everything without family support. I gave Michael exactly what he said he wanted, the chance to prove that his success is genuinely self-made. Victoria was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Robert, my parents are asking questions about Michael's business and our financial planning. They want to know why we suddenly can't afford the house we were planning to buy, Why Michael seems so stressed and distracted all the time? Why our whole lifestyle seems to have changed overnight? What are you telling them? I don't know what to tell them. Michael says it's temporary, that you're just making a point and that everything will go back to normal soon. But I don't think that's true, is it? Victoria, that depends entirely on Michael. If he can build a genuinely profitable business without family money, then he won't need the trust fund. But if he can't, then no amount of apology or negotiation is going to restore funding for someone who considers that funding worthless. The third consequence was perhaps the most painful for me to watch, even though it was exactly what I had intended to happen. Michael's confidence and self-assurance, the qualities that had made him successful in Silicon Valley's social circles, began to crumble under the pressure of facing real financial uncertainty for the first time in his adult life. He started calling me every few days, ostensibly to discuss business decisions or ask for advice, but really to test whether I was softening my position on the trust fund. These conversations were difficult because they reminded me of the scared, uncertain young man he had been when he first started his company, before the safety net of family money had given him the confidence to take risks and project success. Dad, I've been thinking about what you said, about proving that I can succeed without family money. I want to do that. I want to show you that I'm capable of building something on my own. Then do it, I said. But I need to know that you'll be proud of me when I succeed. I need to know that we can rebuild our relationship once I've proven myself. This was the conversation I had both hoping and dreading. Michael was finally beginning to understand that his success had been built on a foundation of family support that he had taken for granted and publicly dismissed. But he was still thinking about the trust fund as something he could earn back, rather than something he needed to learn to live without permanently. Michael, I want you to succeed. I've always wanted you to succeed. But you can't succeed in order to get the trust fund back. You have to succeed because you want to build something meaningful with your life. I do want that, but I also want to repair our relationship. I want to be able to introduce you to people as my father instead of hiding you in the back of the room. Then start doing that now. You don't need to wait until your business is profitable. You don't need to earn the right to treat your father with respect. It's not that simple. People in my world, they judge you based on your family background. If they think you come from nothing, they assume you don't understand how success works. Michael, I didn't come from nothing. I came from a working-class family that taught me the value of hard work and sacrifice. I built financial security for our family through 40 years of disciplined saving and smart investing. That's nothing. That's something to be proud of. I know that now. I wish I had understood it before. But even as Michael expressed regret about how he had treated me, I could hear in his voice that he still didn't fully understand what he had lost or what he needed to learn. He was approaching our relationship like a business negotiation, looking for the terms and conditions that would restore his access to family money rather than genuinely examining the attitudes and assumptions that had led him to dismiss his father as worthless in the first place. The most telling moment came at the end of one of our conversations, when Michael said something that
8 months after the wedding, Michael showed up at my door unannounced on a Saturday morning in March. I was in my garage working on restoring a 1967 Mustang that I had bought with some of the profits from my aggressive investment strategy when I heard his familiar knock on the front door. When I opened it, I hardly recognized the man standing on my porch. The polished, confident entrepreneur who had given speeches about self-made success was gone. In his place stood someone who looked like he had aged 5 years in 8 months. Michael was thinner than I had ever seen him, wearing jeans and a plain t-shirt instead of the designer clothes that had become his uniform. His hair needed cutting, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of months of sleepless nights and genuine worry. "Dad," he said quietly, "can we talk?" I invited him into the kitchen and made coffee while he sat at the same table where I had helped him with homework 20 years earlier. We didn't speak for several minutes, just sat drinking coffee and looking out the window at the backyard where he had learned to ride a bicycle and play catch. "I came to tell you that you were right," Michael said finally. "About everything. About me not understanding what success actually means. About me taking your sacrifices for granted. About me being embarrassed by the father who made my entire life possible." I waited for him to continue, sensing that this conversation had been building in his mind for months. Innovate Now Solutions failed. We had to declare bankruptcy last month. David and I lost everything. The office, the equipment, the employees we couldn't afford to pay. We're both looking for jobs now, trying to figure out how to start over from scratch. I had known this was coming. James Mitchell had been tracking Michael's company through industry contacts, and the warning signs had been obvious for months. Without the trust fund safety net, Michael had been forced to make increasingly desperate decisions to keep the company afloat, taking on clients and projects that were profitable in the short term, but unsustainable as a business model. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and I meant it. Despite everything that had happened between us, I had never wanted to see Michael fail. I had wanted him to learn to succeed without taking family support for granted. "The thing is," Michael continued, "losing the business was actually the best thing that could have happened to me, because it forced me to understand something I never learned when I had your money as a backup plan." "What's that?" "I learned what it feels like to actually earn something. For the past 4 months, I've been working as a software consultant, taking on small projects for local businesses, basically doing the kind of practical, unglamorous work that keeps companies running instead of the big vision, revolutionary technology stuff I used to think was the only work worth doing." Michael pulled out his phone and showed me a simple website he had built for a family restaurant in Sacramento. "This isn't going to change the world," he said. "It's not going to make me famous or get me written up in tech magazines, but I built it with my own skills. I delivered exactly what the client needed, and they paid me fairly for work I could be proud of." "How does that feel different from running Innovate Now?" "It feels honest," Michael said. "When I was running Innovate Now, I was always selling a vision of what the company could become, what we might accomplish if we got the right funding and made the right connections. I was good at talking about potential and possibility, but I was never very good at just delivering value to people who needed help with practical problems." I could see something in Michael's face that I hadn't seen since he was a teenager, a kind of quiet satisfaction that came from completing difficult work and knowing you had earned whatever recognition or payment you received. "Dad, I need to apologize to you for something specific. Not just the wedding speech, although that was inexcusable. I need to apologize for 32 years of assuming that your love and support were things I deserved rather than gifts you chose to give me." "Michael, no, let me finish. I need to say this." He took a deep breath. "Dad, I want you to know that I finally understand what you built for our family. You built security without sacrificing your values. You built wealth without forgetting where you came from. You built success without needing to impress people who didn't matter. You built a life that was meaningful rather than just profitable." His voice got stronger as he continued. "I also want you to know that I'm not asking for the trust fund back. I'm not asking for financial help or investment in my next business venture. I'm asking for something much more important, the chance to rebuild a relationship with the man who taught me everything I actually needed to know about success, even though it took me 32 years to understand the lessons." I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight for 8 months. "Michael, you never lost the chance to rebuild our relationship.
You just had to want to do it for the right reasons. What are the right reasons? Because you value having a father more than you value having access to his money. Because you want to learn from my experience rather than just benefit from my resources. Because you finally understand that respecting someone isn't the same thing as needing something from them. Michael nodded and folded up the paper. Dad, would you be willing to meet Victoria? She's been wanting to apologize to you for months, but she was too embarrassed about how she acted during the wedding planning. She understands now that she judged you based on appearances instead of character. I'd like that, I said. But, Michael, I need you to understand something. My investment strategy has been extremely successful over the past 8 months. I've made more money in the last year than I made in the previous 5 years combined. Michael was confused. Okay, is that supposed to change something between us? It means that if you had waited, if you had been patient and respectful and grateful for what you already had, you would have inherited significantly more money than the trust fund ever contained. Instead of $2 million, you could have been looking at $5 or $6 million. Michael was quiet for a long time, processing this information. Then he smiled, the first genuine smile I had seen from him in years. Dad, I'm glad I didn't wait. Because if I had inherited $6 million without learning how to actually earn money through my own work, I would have just been a richer version of the same entitled person who embarrassed you at his wedding. I wouldn't have learned what I needed to learn about respect and gratitude and the difference between deserving something and being given something. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw someone I recognized for the first time in years. Not the polished entrepreneur who had been performing success for Silicon Valley audiences, but the thoughtful, hard-working young man I had raised to value character over status and substance over appearance. Michael, would you like to help me finish restoring that Mustang? I could use someone with good technical skills and attention to detail. I'd love that, but I have to warn you, I don't know anything about classic cars. That's okay. I'll teach you. We have plenty of time to figure it out together. For the first time in 8 months, I felt like I had my son back. Not the version who needed my money, but the version who valued my presence. And that was worth more than any trust fund could ever be.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.